One choice. One moment. One love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Some children don't hate the world, the old therapist once told Nathaniel Reed. They just stop believing the world is safe enough to smile at. Nathaniel remembered those words as he stepped out of the black Escalade into the freezing Boston rain, one hand gripping an umbrella, the other trying to keep his 8-year-old son from bolting into the parking lot. Elliot Reed didn't scream. He never did. That would have been easier. Easier than the silence. Easier than the blank stare and trembling fingers and the way he folded into himself whenever the world became too loud. The small cafe on Hanover Street glowed warm against the stormy afternoon, golden lights reflecting across wet pavement. Reed Technologies had just closed a $2.3 billion acquisition 40 minutes earlier. CNBC was calling Nathaniel the most ruthless CEO in biotech. Forbes had called him the man who outgrew Silicon Valley. None of it mattered right now, because Elliot hadn't spoken to another human being in almost 11 months. Nathaniel pushed open the cafe door while Elliot immediately covered his ears at the sound of clinking dishes and espresso machines. Heads turned. They always did. Some with sympathy, others with irritation. Nathaniel had learned to recognize both instantly. Window booth, he muttered quietly to the hostess. Elliot needed corners. Walls. Predictability. The hostess nodded nervously as Elliot began lining sugar packets into perfect horizontal rows along the table edge. Nathaniel loosened his tie and opened his laptop, trying to survive 3 back-to-back investor calls while keeping one eye on his son. Outside, rain hammered against the glass. Inside, Elliot tapped the table 3 times every few seconds. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm had become part of Nathaniel's life now, like breathing or exhaustion. Welcome in, a soft voice said nearby. Nathaniel barely looked up at first. Just coffee, he answered distractedly. Black. That's a dangerous way to live. The response made him glance up despite himself. The waitress standing beside the table looked younger than he expected. Mid-20s maybe. Pale cream sweater beneath a dark green apron. Blonde hair loosely pinned up like she'd fixed it in a hurry. She held a coffee pot in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. But it was her expression that caught him off guard. She wasn't forcing cheerfulness. Wasn't giving Elliot pity either. She simply looked calm. Most billionaires at least pretend to enjoy oat milk, she added lightly. Nathaniel blinked once. You know who I am? Boston knows who you are, she said. You bought half the city. Elliot suddenly knocked over 2 sugar packets and stiffened immediately, panic flooding his face. Nathaniel moved automatically. It's okay, buddy. It's okay. But Elliot's breathing had already changed. Fast. Sharp. His fingers curled inward as nearby customers began glancing over. Nathaniel felt that familiar pressure building in his chest. The exhaustion. The embarrassment. The helplessness. Then the waitress crouched beside the table. Slowly. Quietly. Not too close. She didn't speak to Elliot directly. Didn't force eye contact. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and placed 3 things carefully onto the table. A spoon, 2 sugar cubes, and a folded napkin. Elliot stopped moving. Nathaniel watched carefully. The waitress unfolded the napkin to reveal a tiny doodle of a crooked snowman floating in space. Underneath it were 6 words written in blue ink. Want to build a tiny snow planet? Elliot stared at the drawing. His breathing slowed slightly. The waitress picked up the spoon and gently spun 1 sugar cube in the center of the table. This one's Saturn, she whispered casually. Very advanced civilization. Terrible weather. Nathaniel opened his mouth to apologize for whatever disaster was about to happen next. But Elliot reached forward first. Tiny fingers. Careful movements. He touched the 2nd sugar cube. The waitress gasped dramatically. Oh no, she whispered. That's Pluto. They're enemies. Elliot looked at her. Not through her. At her. Nathaniel froze completely. The waitress leaned closer to the table, lowering her voice conspiratorially. If Saturn touches Pluto, she said, the entire galaxy turns into soup. Elliot's lips twitched. Nathaniel's heartbeat stumbled painfully inside his chest. No, it couldn't be. But then it happened. Small. Quick. Barely there. Elliot smiled. The entire cafe seemed to disappear for 1 impossible second. Nathaniel stared at his son like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Elliot smiled again. A real smile this time. Tiny dimples. Eyes softening. His fingers pushed the sugar cube toward the spoon carefully, while the waitress widened her eyes in mock horror. "We're doomed," she whispered. Elliot let out the smallest laugh Nathaniel had heard in over a year. Not loud, not perfect, but real. Nathaniel's laptop screen dimmed from inactivity somewhere beside him. His investor call kept buzzing unanswered. He didn't notice. Couldn't notice. Because for the first time since his wife died 4 years ago, his son looked alive again. The waitress stood slowly like nothing extraordinary had happened. "I'll grab your coffee," she said softly. Nathaniel found his voice only after she walked halfway back toward the counter. "Wait." She turned slightly. "What did you just do?" She looked confused by the question. "I made a very unstable intergalactic political situation," she answered. "Honestly, your son handled it pretty well." Nathaniel almost laughed despite himself. Almost. But his eyes burned too much for that. Elliot reached for another sugar cube. Then quietly, carefully, he looked toward the waitress again, waiting for her to come back. The rain finally stopped 20 minutes later, but Nathaniel Reed still had not touched his coffee. It sat untouched beside his laptop while Elliot carefully balanced sugar cubes into what looked like a crooked castle beside the window. Every few seconds, the boy glanced toward the counter. Waiting. Nathaniel noticed it immediately, because Elliot never waited for people before. He avoided them, escaped them, endured them. But now his small fingers tapped quietly against the booth each time the cafe door opened, as if hoping the waitress would reappear carrying another impossible little universe inside her apron pocket. Nathaniel rubbed a tired hand across his jaw and reopened his laptop just as 3 missed calls from the board flashed across the screen. "Mr. Reed," one of his executives said through speakerphone the second he answered. "The Singapore investors are waiting for confirmation on the merger statement." Nathaniel looked at Elliot instead. "Push it 1 hour." Silence. Then nervous coughing. "Sir, the market closes in 42 minutes. Elliot stacked another sugar cube carefully beside Saturn. Nathaniel watched his son smile faintly to himself. 1 hour. Nathaniel repeated quietly before ending the call. Across the cafe, Clara Whitmore nearly dropped an entire tray of blueberry muffins while attempting to dodge a customer carrying an umbrella indoors. "Whoa, okay." She laughed as the tray tilted dangerously sideways. That was almost a full breakfast tragedy. The older customer chuckled while Clara steadied herself dramatically against the counter like a silent movie actress surviving a shipwreck. Elliot stared openly now. Nathaniel noticed that too. His son hated unpredictable movement, loud gestures, chaotic energy. Yet somehow Clara's awkwardness felt different. Softer. Like she made mistakes without panic. Like she gave the world permission to be imperfect around her. Clara returned to the booth carrying a grilled cheese sandwich cut into uneven triangles and a bowl of tomato soup. "One dinosaur excavation special," she announced. Elliot looked at the plate seriously, then frowned. Clara gasped quietly. "Oh no." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "What?" Clara leaned closer to Elliot. "I accidentally gave the T-Rex long legs." Elliot blinked once. Clara lowered her voice. "That is deeply embarrassing for him." Nathaniel stared as Elliot's shoulders twitched slightly. Another tiny laugh. Barely audible. But there. Clara placed both hands dramatically over her face. "I cannot believe I have done this in front of a dinosaur expert." Elliot reached toward the sandwich slowly and snapped off one corner. Clara nodded solemnly. "Yes. Correct. Shorter legs. Thank you." Nathaniel felt something strange tighten painfully inside his chest again. Not shock this time. Grief maybe. Because he suddenly realized how long it had been since someone treated Elliot like a child instead of a diagnosis. Not fragile. Not difficult. Just the little boy with opinions about dinosaur anatomy. Clara finally glanced toward Nathaniel. "You should eat too, you know." "I am fine." That usually means the opposite. Nathaniel almost responded automatically with something cold and dismissive. The kind of answer people expected from him. But Clara was already walking away before he could say anything. She did not linger for approval, did not flirt, did not stare at his watch or his tailored coat or the headlines attached to his name. Somehow that unsettled him more than attention ever did. 40 minutes later, the lunch rush slowed. Elliot now sat cross-legged in the booth arranging crayons Clara had secretly left beside the napkin dispenser. Nathaniel watched his son sketch careful circles onto a paper placemat while softly humming under his breath. Humming. Nathaniel had not heard that sound in months. He likes her, a voice said quietly nearby. Nathaniel looked up to find an elderly woman sipping tea at the neighboring table. Excuse me. The woman smiled gently toward Elliot. My grandson is autistic too. She lowered her voice kindly. You can always tell when they feel safe around someone. Nathaniel glanced back toward Clara behind the counter. She was currently arguing with the espresso machine like it had personally betrayed her family. You steamed the milk yesterday, she muttered at the machine. Do not act brand new today. The elderly woman laughed softly. That girl has a kind spirit. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment, then quietly asked, Do you know her? Only from coming here too often. The woman smiled. But she remembers every customer's order. Gives free muffins to exhausted mothers. Talks to lonely people like she has nowhere else to be. Nathaniel looked down at his untouched coffee again. Strange. In his world, kindness usually arrived attached to contracts or expectations or cameras. Clara Whitmore moved through the cafe like none of that existed. As the afternoon light dimmed beyond the windows, Elliot suddenly slid out of the booth. Nathaniel straightened instantly. Buddy. But Elliot was already walking. Slowly toward the counter. One careful step at a time. Clara looked up from refilling sugar jars just as Elliot stopped in front of her. The entire cafe seemed to pause again. Elliot held something tightly in his hand. A folded paper napkin. Clara crouched carefully to his eye level. Hey, Saturn ambassador. Elliot looked nervous for one long second, then slowly handed her the napkin. Clara unfolded it. Nathaniel could not see the drawing clearly from across the room. But Clara's entire expression softened instantly. Is this me? She whispered. Elliot nodded once. Tiny. Quick. Clara pressed a hand dramatically to her heart. Okay, this is officially the best thing that has happened to me all year. Elliot smiled again. Bigger this time. And Nathaniel Reed, the billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, suddenly found himself unable to look away from the shy waitress holding a child's crumpled drawing like it was the most valuable thing she had ever received. By 6 o'clock, the cafe windows had turned black with evening rain and reflected little pools of golden light across the tables. Most customers were gone now. Chairs scraped softly against hardwood floors while the espresso machine finally fell silent for the first time all day. Elliot still sat in the booth beside the window, clutching a crayon in one hand and half a dinosaur sandwich in the other. Nathaniel checked his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes before realizing something deeply strange. He was late to his own private jet departure, and he did not care. Clara moved through the cafe stacking plates on a trays while softly singing under her breath to some old Frank Sinatra song playing from the kitchen radio. Her voice was not polished, just warm, real, the kind of voice that belonged beside rainy windows and coffee steam. Elliot watched her constantly now. Nathaniel noticed every glance, every tiny reaction, the way his son's shoulders no longer stayed rigid, the way he no longer flinched every time somebody walked too close to the table. Clara finally approached, carrying the check tucked beneath a tiny ceramic dinosaur toy balanced carefully on top. Your son's lawyer insisted Saturn needed legal representation, she explained seriously. Nathaniel stared at the toy. You gave him this? Clara shrugged lightly. The dollar store downtown has an entire basket of emotionally available dinosaurs. Elliot immediately picked up the toy and held it against his chest like treasure. Nathaniel looked down at the untouched black credit card resting beside the receipt, then slowly back up at Clara. Sit down for a minute. Clara blinked once. That sounds suspiciously like rich person behavior. I am trying to thank you. Most people just say thank you. Nathaniel almost smiled despite himself. Almost. Clara glanced around the empty cafe before sliding carefully into the opposite side of the booth. She sat sideways with one knee tucked beneath her apron, completely unlike anyone in Nathaniel's world. No rehearsed elegance. No strategic posture. She looked comfortable being human. Elliot quietly rolled the tiny dinosaur across the table between them while Nathaniel studied Clara carefully for the first time. Faint flower smudge on her sleeve. Tiny scar near her chin. Blue-gray eyes that looked tired in a familiar kind of way. How did you do it? He asked quietly. Clara tilted her head. Do what? Nathaniel looked toward Elliot. He has not smiled at someone in over a year. Clara's expression softened instantly, but not with pity. Never pity. You were watching him too hard. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Excuse me. People stare at autistic kids like they are puzzles. Clara folded a sugar packet absent-mindedly between her fingers. Doctors, therapists, parents sometimes. Her voice stayed gentle. Everybody watches them waiting for progress. Nathaniel looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. Because she was not entirely wrong. Clara nodded toward Elliot, quietly arranging crayons by color now. I was not trying to get him to smile. Then what were you trying to do? Play with him. The simplicity of the answer landed harder than Nathaniel expected. For a moment, only rain filled the silence between them. Then Nathaniel spoke quietly. You have experience with children like Elliot. Clara's fingers paused slightly around the sugar packet, just enough for Nathaniel to notice. Some. That is not a real answer. You sound like a billionaire. I am one. Clara sighed dramatically. Right. Sorry. I forgot while watching you lose an argument to a grilled cheese sandwich. Elliot suddenly pushed the dinosaur toy toward Clara. She gasped softly. For me? Elliot nodded once. Clara placed a hand over her heart again, like she might cry over a plastic dinosaur worth 99 cents. Nathaniel watched Elliot carefully. His son hated sharing prized objects. Usually meltdowns followed immediately afterward. But Elliot simply leaned closer toward Clara instead, quietly studying the freckles near her nose like they fascinated him. He likes patterns, Clara said softly without looking up. Your freckles? Nathaniel asked before realizing how ridiculous the question sounded. Clara laughed quietly. No, my earrings. Nathaniel glanced down. Tiny silver moons. Elliot reached toward one carefully. Clara stayed perfectly still. Good job asking with your eyes first, she whispered to him. Nathaniel stared at her. Therapists had spent years teaching Elliot boundaries and social cues through flashcards and repetitive exercises. Clara somehow translated those same lessons into normal conversation without making him feel studied. It was like watching somebody speak a language nobody else understood. Nathaniel leaned back slowly. I want to hire you. Clara blinked once, then immediately laughed. No, you did not even let me finish. You are wearing a watch worth more than my car, she said calmly. People wearing watches like that never finish sentences cheaply. Nathaniel ignored the comment. I can pay whatever you want. See? There it is. Clara slid out of the booth and grabbed the check from the table. That thing rich men do where they think kindness can be put on payroll. Nathaniel stood instinctively. That is not what I meant. Clara looked at him then. Really looked at him. Her expression softened slightly at whatever exhaustion she saw hiding behind the expensive suit and controlled posture. I know, she said quietly. That is actually the problem. Nathaniel fell silent. Across the cafe, an employee flipped the front sign from open to closed while soft jazz crackled through the old speakers overhead. Elliot suddenly tugged lightly on Clara's sleeve. She crouched beside him immediately. What is up, Saturn Ambassador? Elliot hesitated, then pointed slowly toward the front door. Toward her. Toward himself. Clara looked confused for half a second before realization warmed across her face. You want me to walk you outside? Elliot nodded once. Nathaniel's throat tightened unexpectedly as Clara smiled softly and held out her hand. Elliot stared at it for one long second, then carefully slipped his small hand into hers. The rain had faded into cold mist by the time they stepped outside the cafe. Boston streets shimmered silver beneath streetlights, while passing taxis sprayed water across the curb. Clara walked slowly beside Elliot, letting him hold only 2 fingers instead of her full hand. Nathaniel noticed that immediately too. She adjusted herself constantly around Elliot without making it obvious. No pressure, no sudden movements, no voice raised too high. Elliot stopped halfway down the sidewalk beside a newspaper stand glowing beneath fluorescent lights. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. Then quietly, he looked toward Clara again. Waiting. Clara leaned closer to the window dramatically. Okay, she whispered. I need your professional opinion. Elliot blinked once. Do you think raccoons know they are adorable? Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. What? Clara pointed seriously toward a magazine cover, showing a raccoon digging through trash. Look at that little criminal. He knows exactly what he is doing. Elliot's lips twitched again. Nathaniel stared at his son in disbelief. For years, therapists had tried to teach Elliot social engagement through scheduled emotional exercises. Clara somehow achieved more by discussing raccoons like they were tiny, organized crime bosses. Elliot lightly tapped the glass twice. Clara gasped. Exactly. That is raccoon behavior. Another tiny laugh escaped him. Nathaniel felt something inside his chest crack open a little wider. Then his phone rang again. Sharp. Loud. Elliot flinched. Instantly, shoulders tightening. Nathaniel silenced the call immediately. Too late. Elliot stepped backward toward the building wall, breathing faster now. Clara lowered herself carefully beside him. Hey, she said softly. Too loud, huh? Elliot pressed his palms over his ears. Nathaniel moved forward automatically. Buddy, look at me. But Elliot's breathing only worsened. Nearby headlights flashed across the wet street. A motorcycle revved somewhere downtown. Too much noise. Too many lights. Nathaniel felt panic rise instantly beneath his calm expression. He knew this spiral. Knew how quickly things could collapse once Elliot became overstimulated. Clara reached slowly into her apron pocket. Emergency situation, she whispered seriously. Nathaniel frowned. Clara pulled out a single wrapped peppermint candy. This is classified astronaut candy. Elliot hesitated through uneven breathing. Clara unwrapped the peppermint halfway before placing it gently onto the newspaper stand ledge beside him instead of directly into his hand. No pressure. No demand. NASA uses these during very important raccoon negotiations. Elliot stared at the peppermint for several seconds, then slowly picked it up. His breathing softened little by little. Nathaniel exhaled shakily without realizing he had stopped breathing too. Clara stood once Elliot settled again. Peppermints are magic, she said quietly. Scientifically proven. Nathaniel looked at her carefully beneath the glow of the streetlights. You always carry those? Clara shrugged lightly. Life gets overwhelming sometimes. For one strange second, neither of them moved. Rainwater dripped softly from awnings overhead, while Elliot quietly rotated the peppermint wrapper between his fingers beside them. Nathaniel suddenly realized how long it had been since another adult stood beside him during one of Elliot's difficult moments without judgment. Most people either stared too hard or disappeared entirely. Clara simply stayed. Like staying was the easiest thing in the world. A black SUV finally pulled to the curb. Nathaniel's driver stepped out immediately holding another umbrella. Sir, he said quietly. Clara instantly took a small step backward as though returning Nathaniel to his real world now that the moment outside the cafe was over. Expensive cars. Security details. Billion-dollar schedules. Nathaniel looked toward Elliot. His son still stood close to Clara instead of immediately retreating into himself. Then Elliot did something unexpected again. He tugged lightly on Clara's sleeve. Nathaniel saw uncertainty flicker across Clara's face before she crouched beside him. Elliot carefully held out the tiny dinosaur toy she had given him earlier, then pointed toward the SUV, then toward her. Clara blinked. You want me to come with you? Elliot nodded once. Nathaniel stared at his son in complete shock. Elliot never invited people into his spaces. Not home. Not cars. Not routines. Clara looked equally surprised. Oh, she whispered softly. That is actually kind of a big deal. Nathaniel swallowed slowly before speaking. You do not have to. Clara looked toward Elliot again. His small fingers still clutched the peppermint wrapper tightly. Waiting. Hoping. Vulnerable in a way Nathaniel almost never saw anymore. Clara sighed dramatically toward the cloudy sky. Well, she said quietly. Now I cannot say no without upsetting interplanetary diplomacy. Elliot smiled again. Small. Quick. But there. 20 minutes later, Clara sat awkwardly inside the back seat of the luxury SUV beside a billionaire and his son, while trying not to spill hot chocolate across $6,000 worth of leather interior. This cup is stressing me out, she admitted while balancing it carefully with both hands. Nathaniel actually laughed softly under his breath before catching himself immediately afterward. Clara noticed. Oh wow, she said. You do know how to make human sounds. Nathaniel shook his head slightly while looking out the rain-covered window. Most people are afraid to talk to me like that. Most people want something from you. Nathaniel glanced toward her again. Clara looked down at Elliot now leaning peacefully against the seat beside her while tracing circles onto the fogged-up window with one finger. I just want him to keep doing that, she whispered softly. Nathaniel followed her. Gazed toward his son. Elliot looked calm. Safe. Present. The city lights blurred gold and silver across the glass while Boston moved quietly around them. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Reed felt something dangerous begin to return to a life built entirely on control. Hope. The penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor was quieter than Clara expected. Billionaires, in her imagination, usually lived surrounded by noise. Assistants, televisions, giant glass rooms filled with people pretending to matter. But Nathaniel Reed's home felt strangely empty for a place worth $30 million. Soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers, while rain slid slowly down massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Elliot walked ahead of them carrying the tiny dinosaur toy in one hand and the peppermint wrapper in the other, like both objects contained national secrets. Clara stepped carefully onto the pale hardwood floors. "I suddenly feel underdressed for oxygen in here," she muttered softly. Nathaniel removed his coat beside the entryway without looking at her. "You get used to it." That sentence alone cost at least $4,000. To Clara's surprise, Elliot let out another tiny laugh near the staircase. Nathaniel froze briefly at the sound before hiding it again behind the same composed expression he wore like armor. A woman in navy scrubs appeared from down the hallway carrying a tablet. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Klein called again regarding tomorrow's behavioral assessment. She stopped mid-sentence after noticing Clara standing there beside Elliot. Her eyes flicked quickly between them with visible confusion. Nathaniel's tone turned cool immediately. Professional. Controlled. "This is Clara Whitmore." The woman blinked once. "Oh." Clara smiled awkwardly and gave a tiny wave. "I come with raccoon expertise and emergency peppermints." The nanny looked deeply uncertain how to process that information. Elliot quietly moved closer toward Clara instead of toward the nanny. Nathaniel noticed. So did the nanny. A strange silence settled briefly across the room. "You can head home, Vanessa," Nathaniel said quietly. "I will handle tonight." Vanessa hesitated. "Sir, Elliot's nighttime transitions have been difficult lately." Elliot immediately stiffened at the word difficult. Clara saw it happen in real time. Tiny tension in his shoulders. Eyes lowering toward the floor. Nathaniel noticed too late. "We are fine," he repeated more gently. Vanessa nodded and left quickly afterward. Elliot remained silent for several seconds after the elevator doors closed behind her, then quietly disappeared down the hallway without warning. Nathaniel's entire body tightened instantly. "Elliot." No answer. Nathaniel moved fast through the penthouse while Clara followed behind him past enormous modern paintings and spotless marble counters that somehow made the home feel colder instead of warmer. They finally found Elliot curled tightly beneath a grand piano in the corner music room, hands pressed hard over his ears. Nathaniel crouched immediately. "Buddy, what happened?" Elliot did not respond. His breathing turned uneven again. Clara stayed near the doorway at first, watching carefully. "What triggered him?" she whispered softly. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair. "I do not know." Then his expression shifted. The word difficult. Clara looked toward Elliot beneath the piano. Small body folded inward. "Hiding." How often does he hear words like that? Nathaniel's silence answered for him. Clara slowly removed her shoes before walking quietly across the rug and sitting cross-legged several feet from the piano instead of directly beside it. She did not reach for Elliot, did not ask questions. She simply looked toward the underside of the piano thoughtfully. "You know," she said softly, "this is actually excellent acoustics for dramatic movie soundtracks." Nathaniel blinked once. Clara tapped lightly against the wooden floor beside her. Very cinematic hiding spot. Elliot's breathing remained shaky. Clara leaned back onto her palms casually. "Personally, if I were emotionally overwhelmed, I would hide in a bakery." Silence. "Probably near the cinnamon rolls." Nathaniel stared at her like she might be insane. Clara ignored him completely. "But honestly, piano fort is a strong choice too." Elliot shifted slightly beneath the piano. Tiny movement. Clara noticed immediately, but pretended not to, especially if there are snacks involved. Another tiny shift. Then finally, quietly, Elliot peeked out from beneath the piano edge. Clara widened her eyes dramatically. "Oh wow. It comes with a resident cryptid." Elliot's lips twitched faintly again. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten unexpectedly while watching the scene unfold. Clara lowered her voice slightly. "Can I tell you a secret?" Elliot looked toward her carefully. Sometimes grown-ups use words they do not mean because they are tired. Her voice stayed gentle. But tired people are not always truthful people. Elliot stared at her for several long seconds, then slowly lowered his hands from his ears. Nathaniel looked down at the floor beside him. because suddenly he realized how many conversations about Elliot had happened in front of Elliot over the years. Difficult, delayed, complicated, challenging, like his son was a problem to solve instead of a person listening quietly from the corner. Clara stood carefully after another minute. "Okay," she announced softly. "New mission." Elliot blinked up at her. "We need hot chocolate immediately before emotional damage occurs." Elliot slowly crawled out from beneath the piano. Nathaniel exhaled shakily without realizing he had stopped breathing again. 20 minutes later, the enormous luxury kitchen looked significantly less elegant. Marshmallows covered half the counter. Clara had somehow convinced Elliot to wear a chef hat she found inside a drawer. Nathaniel stood nearby holding a saucepan like it might explode at any moment. "You have definitely never cooked before," Clara informed him while stirring cocoa powder into milk. "I own restaurants. That is Billionaire for I know a guy who cooks." Elliot giggled softly into his sleeve. Nathaniel stared at his son again. Another laugh. Another impossible sound filling rooms that had stayed painfully silent for years. Clara handed Elliot a spoon carefully dipped in hot chocolate. "Professional taste test." Elliot nodded seriously after one sip. Clara looked relieved. "Thank goodness. I cannot emotionally survive negative Yelp reviews tonight." Nathaniel watched them beside the warm kitchen lights while snow finally began falling softly beyond the giant harbor windows. For the first time since his wife's funeral 4 years earlier, his home no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in. Snow covered Boston overnight, turning the harbor outside Nathaniel Reed's penthouse into a blur of silver and white by morning. Clara woke slowly on the oversized couch beneath a cashmere blanket she absolutely refused to admit felt amazing. For several quiet seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she noticed the 12-foot Christmas tree glowing softly beside the windows and nearly rolled off the couch in panic. "Right?" she whispered to herself. "Accidentally slept at Billionaire headquarters." Somewhere deeper in the penthouse, something crashed loudly. Clara sat upright instantly. Another noise followed. Then a deeply frustrated male voice. "Why is it smoking?" Clara blinked twice before following the smell of burnt batter toward the kitchen. She stopped in the doorway and stared. Nathaniel Reed stood wearing dark sweatpants and an expensive gray sweater while holding a spatula like it had personally betrayed him. Smoke drifted upward from a frying pan while Elliot sat on the counter wearing the tiny chef hat from last night, watching the disaster unfold with silent fascination. Clara crossed her arms slowly. "Should I call the fire department now or wait until the pancakes become sentient?" Nathaniel looked genuinely offended. "I am making breakfast." Clara stared at the blackened object inside the pan. "That thing has seen war." Elliot suddenly made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh before covering his mouth quickly afterward like he was not supposed to do that. Nathaniel froze completely at the sound. Clara noticed immediately and softened her tone. "Okay," she announced, walking toward the stove. "Move aside, Billionaire." Nathaniel stepped back reluctantly while Clara surveyed the damage. Flour covered the marble island. Eggshells somehow sat inside a coffee mug. There was syrup on the ceiling. How did syrup get up there? Nathaniel looked upward. "I honestly do not know." Elliot giggled again. "Clear this time." Clara pointed dramatically toward him. "See? The tiny dictator enjoys chaos." 20 minutes later, the kitchen looked warmer somehow. Messier too. Clara stood at the stove flipping pancakes while Elliot carefully placed blueberries into smiley faces beside her. Nathaniel attempted to cut strawberries, but somehow produced shapes resembling abstract modern art instead. "You are terrible at this," Clara informed him calmly. "I negotiate billion-dollar pharmaceutical acquisitions. And yet a banana has defeated you." Nathaniel looked down at the uneven banana slices in visible irritation. Elliot laughed softly into his sleeve again. Nathaniel turned toward his son almost cautiously now, like sudden happiness might disappear if he moved too quickly near it. Clara noticed that too. The carefulness, the fear beneath the control. After breakfast, Elliot quietly tugged Clara toward the giant windows overlooking the harbor. Snowflakes drifted endlessly outside while tiny boats moved through icy gray water below. Elliot pressed one hand against the glass. Clara crouched beside him. "You want to go outside?" Elliot nodded immediately. Nathaniel looked up from his phone. "It is 28 degrees. Clara shrugged. "Children survived the 1800s somehow. That is not comforting." But an hour later, Nathaniel still found himself standing awkwardly in Boston Common, wearing a designer wool coat, while Clara attempted to teach Elliot how to build a snow dinosaur. "Its tail is too emotional," Clara declared while reshaping the snow pile dramatically. Nathaniel stared at her. "What does that even mean?" "You can feel when a dinosaur has unresolved issues." Elliot nearly slipped while laughing quietly beside them. Nathaniel reacted instantly, steadying him before he fell. Elliot looked up at his father. Then something small but extraordinary happened. Instead of pulling away from the contact like usual, Elliot stayed there, one gloved hand resting lightly against Nathaniel's sleeve. Nathaniel stopped breathing for half a second. Clara pretended not to notice and continued arguing with the snow dinosaur. "Honestly, this creature needs therapy." Nearby tourists occasionally glanced their direction without recognizing the billionaire kneeling in snow, trying to sculpt tiny dinosaur arms, while his son laughed beside a waitress wearing mismatched mittens. For the first time in years, Nathaniel did not feel like the most important person in every room. He felt like a father. And strangely, it mattered more. Later that afternoon, they ducked into a tiny bookstore cafe to warm up. Elliot wandered quietly through the children's section, while Clara sat across from Nathaniel near the window, stirring hot chocolate absent-mindedly. Snow melted slowly from the ends of her hair. Nathaniel studied her carefully over the rim of his coffee cup. "You are good with him." Clara looked down into her mug instead of answering immediately. "He is easy to understand." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Most specialists say the opposite." Clara gave a small shrug. "That is because most people only listen to words." Her voice softened slightly. "Elliot says plenty." Nathaniel watched her quietly for several seconds, then asked the question sitting heavily in his chest since yesterday. "How did you learn all this?" Clara's fingers tightened faintly around the mug. Tiny movement. Almost invisible. "Life," she answered softly. Nathaniel could tell immediately she was hiding something. But before he could ask another question, Elliot suddenly returned carrying a dinosaur picture book and placed it directly onto Clara's lap. Clara gasped dramatically. "You trust me with your literature collection already?" Elliot nodded once. Clara opened the book carefully while Elliot climbed beside her near the window. Nathaniel watched them together beneath the warm bookstore lights while snow drifted endlessly outside. Elliot leaned comfortably against Clara now, like he had known her far longer than 24 hours. Clara read quietly, while occasionally changing her voice for different dinosaurs in ways so ridiculous even Nathaniel found himself smiling despite every instinct telling him not to. Then Clara looked up suddenly and caught him watching her. Neither of them spoke for one long second. But something shifted there anyway. Small, quiet, dangerous in its softness. Like two exhausted people accidentally standing too close to warmth after years in the cold. 3 days later, Boston woke to headlines about Nathaniel Reed for completely different reasons than usual. Not mergers. Not technology. Not billion-dollar negotiations. Grainy cell phone photos now spread across social media, showing one of the richest men in America kneeling in snow beside a half-built dinosaur, while a waitress laughed beside him, holding hot chocolate. Another photo showed Nathaniel carrying Elliot through downtown wrapped in a scarf, while Clara walked beside them, smiling at something Elliot had drawn on her glove with a marker. The internet lost its mind immediately. "Who is the mystery waitress?" one headline demanded. "Boston billionaire finally smiles?" asked another. Clara nearly choked on orange juice when a customer shoved a phone in front of her face during her morning shift at the cafe. "Oh my God," the college student whispered excitedly. "That is literally you." Clara stared at the article while bagels burned quietly in the background. "I look like a confused marshmallow in that photo." "You are trending on TikTok." That sentence alone shortened my lifespan. Across town, Nathaniel sat at the head of a 43rd floor boardroom while 12 executives stared at him with varying levels of concern. Usually, Nathaniel controlled every room effortlessly. Today felt different. Too many eyes. Too much hesitation. His chief financial officer finally cleared his throat carefully. "Nathaniel, investors are asking questions." Nathaniel did not look up from the tablet in front of him. "About what?" Silence. Then another executive spoke carefully. "The optics." Nathaniel finally lifted his eyes slowly. Dangerous calm settled across the room immediately. "Explain." A nervous cough. "You have missed 3 major calls this week. The Singapore merger has stalled." The board is concerned your priorities may be, he hesitated. Shifting. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind him reflected cold, gray Boston skies across polished glass tables. My son spoke 2 new words yesterday, he said quietly. Confused. Silence filled the room. Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. Do you understand what that means to me? Nobody answered. Because billionaires were allowed to buy islands. Companies. Buildings. But not softness. Not vulnerability. Not public emotion. One older board member adjusted his glasses awkwardly. Of course we care about Elliot, Nathaniel, but Reed Technologies cannot pause every time. Nathaniel stood before the sentence finished. The room immediately fell silent. Every time what? His voice stayed low, controlled, which somehow made it worse. Every time my autistic son finally starts reconnecting with the world? Nobody moved. Nathaniel looked around the boardroom slowly. Men who once praised him for working through his wife's funeral. Investors who celebrated when he slept 4 hours a night after Elliot's diagnosis because productivity remained unaffected. For years, they admired his ability to function without visibly breaking. I built this company after my wife died, Nathaniel said quietly, while raising a child who stopped speaking to me for months at a time. His voice roughened slightly. Do not stand there pretending any of you were worried about balance before now. Across town, Clara remained completely unaware of the corporate earthquake unfolding because she was currently trying to stop Elliot from feeding whipped cream to pigeons outside the cafe patio. Sir, she whispered dramatically toward one particularly aggressive bird. You are becoming emotionally dependent on dairy products. Elliot laughed softly beside her while clutching a paper cup of hot chocolate. Nathaniel arrived 20 minutes later wearing a dark wool coat and the exhausted expression of a man one inconvenience away from throwing somebody through a conference table verbally. Clara immediately noticed. Oh wow, she said carefully. You have business face on. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Business face. You look like somebody explained cryptocurrency incorrectly. Elliot reached for Nathaniel's hand before he even sat down. Nathaniel froze again at the instinctive gesture, then slowly squeezed Elliot's small fingers once. Clara pretended not to notice how much that mattered. Rough morning? She asked quietly. Nathaniel stared out toward the snowy street for several long seconds before answering. Apparently billionaires are not supposed to build snow dinosaurs during market hours. Clara snorted into her coffee. Tragic. Nathaniel finally looked toward her. Really looked. They think I am distracted. Clara's humor softened immediately. Are you? Nathaniel glanced toward Elliot, now carefully feeding tiny marshmallows to the world's fattest pigeon. Then back toward Clara. For the first time in years, he admitted quietly, I think I might finally be paying attention to the right things. Something warm flickered across Clara's face before she looked down quickly into her coffee cup. Elliot suddenly tugged Nathaniel's sleeve and pointed excitedly toward the sidewalk across the street. A little boy around Elliot's age stood there crying while overwhelmed parents tried calming him beside a crowded crosswalk. Loud traffic. Honking horns. Too much movement. Nathaniel instinctively stiffened. He knew that panic. Knew those sounds. But before he could react, Elliot surprised both adults completely. Slowly. Carefully. He pulled the tiny plastic dinosaur from his coat pocket, then held it toward the other boy through the cafe patio fence. The crying child paused immediately, stared at the dinosaur, then slowly accepted it. Clara covered her mouth softly. Nathaniel looked at his son like the entire world had tilted sideways again, because for years Elliot barely reached outward at all. And now here he was, offering comfort to someone else. Elliot looked up toward his father uncertainly. Nathaniel's eyes burned instantly. That was kind, buddy, he whispered roughly. Elliot smiled faintly. Clara looked away toward the falling snow, pretending not to notice the tears Nathaniel quickly wiped from beneath his eyes. The auditorium smelled faintly like crayons, coffee, and winter coats drying from melted snow. Folding chairs filled the elementary school gymnasium, while handmade paper stars hung crookedly from the ceiling beside banners reading Autism Acceptance Night. Parents moved through the crowd carrying snacks and sensory headphones while children darted between tables displaying paintings, science projects, and carefully arranged collections of rocks, trains, and dinosaurs. Clara stood near the entrance adjusting the sleeve of her sweater nervously, while Elliot sat quietly beside her, holding the tiny plastic dinosaur from weeks earlier. Nathaniel arrived 10 minutes late directly from Manhattan, still wearing the charcoal overcoat from a board meeting that had ended badly enough to leave headlines buzzing all afternoon. Reed Technologies stock had dipped 3% after rumors spread that the Billionaire chief executive was emotionally distracted. Nathaniel no longer cared. Not after receiving the text Clara sent him an hour earlier. Elliot wants to try speaking tonight. Nathaniel had reread those 6 words at least 20 times during the helicopter ride home. Now he stood frozen near the gym entrance while Elliot stared anxiously at the growing crowd. Too many voices. Too many fluorescent lights. Nathaniel recognized the signs immediately. Elliot's fingers tapping rapidly against his coat sleeve. His breathing changing slightly. Clara crouched beside him calmly. "Hey," she whispered softly. "Remember our deal?" Elliot looked toward her carefully. Clara nodded toward the tiny dinosaur in his hand. Tiny emotional support lawyer dinosaur stays on duty the whole time. Elliot's shoulders relaxed a little. Nathaniel moved closer slowly. "Buddy," he said gently. "We can leave anytime you want." Elliot looked down instead of answering. Clara stood beside Nathaniel quietly while children practiced holiday songs on a small stage near the gym bleachers. "He has been talking more at school," she whispered softly. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "How much more?" Clara smiled faintly. "Yesterday he corrected a substitute teacher about dinosaur extinction timelines for 4 straight minutes." Nathaniel stared at her. Clara nodded seriously. Apparently the Jurassic period was personally important to him. For a moment, Nathaniel almost laughed. Then he looked toward Elliot again, and emotion hit him too fast for humor to survive it. His son sat in a crowded room. Not hiding. Not curled. Inward. Staying. That alone felt miraculous. A teacher approached them holding a clipboard and warm smile. "Mr. Reed." Nathaniel straightened automatically. "Yes. We are so glad Elliot came tonight." She glanced kindly toward the boy. "The kids each get 30 seconds at the microphone if they want to share something important to them." Nathaniel looked instantly toward Elliot. "Only if he wants to," he said carefully. The teacher nodded warmly. "Of course." Then she walked away toward the stage. Elliot immediately stiffened again. Nathaniel crouched beside him. "No pressure, okay?" Elliot's fingers tightened around the dinosaur. Clara sat quietly beside him on the gym floor despite the expensive adults surrounding them in folding chairs nearby. "You know what I think?" she whispered conspiratorially. Elliot glanced toward her. "I think microphones are kind of weird." Elliot blinked once. Clara nodded seriously. "Tiny robot sticks demanding eye contact. Honestly rude behavior." Elliot's lips twitched faintly. Nathaniel watched Clara carefully again. She never forced bravery onto Elliot. Never demanded progress. She simply made fear smaller. One gentle joke at a time. 20 minutes later, the event began. Children stepped onto the small stage one by one, sharing favorite books, paintings, collections, and stories while proud parents quietly wiped tears nearby. Nathaniel barely listened. His attention stayed locked on Elliot sitting beside Clara, gripping the plastic dinosaur tighter each minute. Then suddenly the microphone squealed loudly. Too loud. Elliot flinched violently, hands covering his ears instantly. Panic flooded his face. Nathaniel reacted immediately. "Buddy, it is okay." But the gym suddenly felt too bright. Too crowded. Too loud. Elliot stood abruptly and backed away from the chairs, breathing unevenly. Several nearby parents turned instinctively toward the commotion. Nathaniel felt that old, helpless panic rising fast beneath his ribs again. Clara moved slower. "Softer." "Elliot," she whispered calmly. "Can you help me with something important?" Elliot's breathing stayed shaky. Clara lowered her voice dramatically. "I forgot how many dinosaur lawyers are legally required in Massachusetts." Elliot blinked through the panic. Clara tapped her chin thoughtfully. "I think it is 3. Tiny pause. Or possibly 7. Elliot's breathing slowed slightly. Clara smiled gently. "Can you tell me?" Elliot stared at her, then quietly held up one finger. Clara gasped loudly enough to make him focus on her instead of the room. "Only 1. That feels legally irresponsible." A tiny laugh escaped him despite himself. Nathaniel exhaled shakily. Then something unexpected happened. The teacher at the microphone smiled warmly toward Elliot from the stage. "Would you like to show us your dinosaur?" she asked kindly. The entire gym fell quiet. Nathaniel immediately prepared himself for Elliot to retreat again. For the fear. The silence. But Elliot looked toward Clara first. She did not nod encouragingly. Did not push. She simply looked at him calmly, like she trusted him already. Elliot slowly walked toward the stage. Nathaniel's heartbeat pounded painfully hard inside his chest. Every parent in the room seemed to stop moving. Elliot climbed the small steps, carefully holding the dinosaur against his sweater. The microphone looked enormous beside him. Too bright. Too loud. Nathaniel nearly stood to stop this before it became too overwhelming. Then Elliot looked down into the crowd, straight toward his father. Silence stretched across the gymnasium. Nathaniel's eyes burned instantly. Elliot swallowed hard. Then quietly, shakily, spoke into the microphone. "My dad," his voice trembled. Nathaniel forgot how to breathe. Elliot looked toward Clara one more time before finishing softly. "My dad is trying." The gymnasium fell completely silent. Not awkward silence. Not pity. Something deeper. Softer. Nathaniel pressed a hand hard against his mouth as tears finally broke loose despite years spent mastering control. Because after all the therapies and specialists and sleepless nights and loneliness, his son had just spoken the words Nathaniel needed most. Spring arrived quietly in Boston that year. Snow disappeared from the harbor first, then from sidewalks, then from the edges of people who had spent too long surviving winter alone. By April, newspapers no longer called Clara Whitmore the mystery waitress. People knew her name now, mostly because Nathaniel Reed had shocked the business world again 3 months after the school event by announcing something nobody expected during a live press conference. Reed Technologies will fund the creation of sensory-inclusive education centers across Massachusetts, he said calmly beneath flashing cameras. Not because it is profitable, because children deserve spaces where they are not treated like problems to solve. Reporters stared at him like he had started speaking another language entirely. Then Nathaniel looked toward the front row where Clara sat beside Elliot, holding the same tiny dinosaur from the cafe months earlier. And for the first time in his career, the billionaire smiled during a press conference. Really smiled. Warm. Human. Dangerous for stock prices apparently. Social media exploded again within minutes. Investors complained. Analysts panicked. Nathaniel ignored all of them. Because Elliot had spoken 4 full sentences that morning while helping Clara burn blueberry muffins in the penthouse kitchen. Priorities had changed. Completely. One Friday evening in early May, Clara stood inside the old cafe on Hanover Street wiping down tables near closing time while Frank Sinatra played softly through crackling speakers overhead. The cafe looked exactly the same as the night everything started. Same warm lights. Same crooked chalkboard menu. Same booth near the rain-covered window. Except now there were tiny dinosaur stickers hidden near the sugar jars because Elliot had declared the cafe officially emotionally safe. Clara smiled to herself while stacking mugs. Then the front bell chimed softly. She looked up automatically. Nathaniel stood there holding Elliot's hand beneath the glow of the entry lights. No bodyguards tonight. No assistants. Just the 3 of them and the smell of coffee drifting through warm air. Clara crossed her arms lightly. "You know we have become deeply concerning regulars." Nathaniel removed his coat slowly. "I own several restaurants and somehow still prefer this place. That is because our raccoons have stronger personalities." Elliot walked immediately toward their usual booth beside the window while carrying something carefully wrapped in silver paper. Clara noticed instantly. "What is that?" Elliot looked toward his father uncertainly. Nathaniel nodded gently once. Elliot slowly handed the small package toward Clara. She unwrapped it carefully while both boys watched her with matching nervous expressions. Inside the paper sat a tiny silver spoon mounted inside a glass frame. Clara blinked in confusion. Then she noticed the engraving beneath it. "For the woman who taught my son to smile." The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Clara stared at the spoon while emotion rose too fast inside her chest. "Nathaniel," her voice cracked slightly. Nathaniel looked down briefly before speaking. "Do you remember the first day?" Clara laughed softly through sudden tears. "You mean the day you almost burned down your emotional stability over coffee?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "You put a spoon and 2 sugar cubes on a table." His voice lowered. "And somehow gave my son back pieces of himself." Clara looked toward Elliot immediately. "No," she shook her head softly. "He did that." Elliot climbed into the booth quietly beside them while holding the dinosaur against his sweater. Nathaniel watched Clara carefully beneath the cafe lights. "Maybe," he admitted, "but you stayed long enough for him to feel safe trying." Clara looked away for a second because nobody had ever said something like that to her before. Not carefully. Not honestly. Outside the cafe windows, spring rain began tapping softly against the glass again, just like the first night they met. Full circle. Elliot suddenly slid something else across the table toward Clara. A folded drawing. Clara opened it slowly. 3 figures stood beneath crooked snowflakes beside an aggressively misshapen dinosaur. 1 tall man. 1 woman with moon earrings. 1 little boy between them holding both their hands. Above the drawing, Elliot had carefully written 3 uneven words in blue marker. My safe people. Clara pressed her hand against her mouth immediately. Nathaniel looked away toward the windows because his eyes burned too much. Again, Elliot leaned sleepily against Clara's shoulder while rain softened the city outside. Nobody spoke for a long moment. They did not need to. The silence no longer felt lonely between them. Nathaniel finally looked back toward Clara. I spent years thinking strength meant handling everything alone. Clara smiled softly through tears. That sounds exhausting. It was. His voice stayed quiet. Honest. Then you walked into our lives carrying peppermints and emotionally unstable dinosaur jokes. Clara laughed shakily. A very professional skill set. Nathaniel leaned closer across the table slightly. Careful. Unrushed. Clara. She looked up. Thank you for staying. Something inside her chest broke open gently at those words. Because nobody had ever thanked her for staying before either. Nathaniel reached slowly across the table. Not dramatic. Not polished. Just real. Clara met him halfway. Their fingers intertwined softly beside the framed silver spoon, while Elliot smiled sleepily against her shoulder like this outcome had been obvious all along. Then Nathaniel kissed her gently beneath the warm cafe lights, while rain blurred Boston into silver outside the windows. No applause. No grand speech. Just one quiet moment between 2 exhausted people who finally stopped feeling alone. And somewhere near the counter, beside the sugar jars and dinosaur stickers, a tiny handwritten sign still remained taped crookedly to the espresso machine. Be kind. You never know how hard someone is trying. If this story touched your heart, please like, share this video, and let us know where you are watching from. And subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more emotional stories about love, healing, and unexpected connections. Your support helps us keep creating cinematic stories that remind people kindness can still change lives. Turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story.